In case you missed it, I'm turning my garage into the ultimate weekend warrior woodworking shop. In part 1, I ripped out the drywall, installed a sub-panel, ran all of the new shop circuits, and had the walls insulated. Next on the to-do list was to add the plywood walls, and my first step was deciding which plywood I wanted to use. I'd originally planned to paint these walls, but after seeing the prices of plywood at my local big box store, I decided to spend a few extra bucks per sheet to get a nicer sanded plywood, which eliminated the need for painting. Once I got the plywood back home, I could start the installation process, starting with the bottom row. And I decided to run my sheets horizontally on this install, and I started by cutting the first sheet to length so it landed centered on a stud. Next, I needed to cut the holes for the outlet boxes, and this was one drawback of running my sheets horizontally. I just had a lot more boxes to contend with. There are a few methods you could use to cut these holes, including an oscillating multi-tool, but I think the jigsaw is by far the easiest. I used 1¼ screws to mount the sheets and just tacked the sheets in place initially, making sure the ends were well secured so my spacing was accurate. I used this plunge cutting technique on the first few sheets, but I found it was easier to just drill holes at each corner of the opening, so I didn't have to try and turn the jigsaw as much while cutting. I added an 1/8" gap between each sheet to kind of accentuate the joints rather than try to hide them, and this meant I needed to trim off that 1/8" from the end of each sheet. The track saw made quick work of this, and I really don't know if I'd attempt this type of wall without a track saw. They just make the process so much easier and leave you with an incredibly clean cut. I wrapped up the first row with the last panel, and then I could move on to the second row, which was really easy since I didn't have any boxes to work around. I did need to trim off that 1/8 inch of material from the end, again using the track saw, then I installed the panel. I used wooden stir sticks as my spacers here since they're a consistent 1/8" thickness, and I have dozens of them hanging around. I also set up a line laser to make sure the ends of the second row were centered on the panel below, since I was going for a running bond pattern. You also might have noticed these boardmate gadgets, which were a total lifesaver for this kind of project. These little plastic guides help to keep the bottom edge of the panel in place, which made the process of installing these sheets by myself much easier. Before I knew it, the second row was done, and all that was left on this first wall was the top row. Since my garage has 10-foot ceilings, this last row needed to be ripped to width, and thankfully the row ended up less than 2 feet wide, so I could get 2 pieces out of one sheet. Once again, the track saw made quick work of this, and if you don't have a track saw, I'd honestly consider investing in one if you're tackling this kind of project. Anyway, I added the board mates, set up my laser lined up with the first row, and then I could install the first sheet in the top row. And this was surprisingly easy, even working by myself, and thankfully this 1/2" plywood was pretty light. The rest of this wall was just rinse and repeat, ripping pieces, then cross-cutting them to length, and after finishing the first wall, I could move on to the other wall. I started with the back wall here for a reason because, as you can probably tell, this left wall had a lot more stuff to work around, including 2 electrical panels, my electric car charger, and the mini split, plus it had about twice the number of outlets. I started this wall to the left of the panels, and I also forgot to mention that I spaced these panels up off the bottom plate by about 1/8 inch, and I used a line laser to make sure the first row was running level. And this is important because the subsequent rows will reference off of the first row, and if it's not straight, things will go sideways in a hurry. Once that panel was in, I had no choice but to tackle the panel I had skipped on the first row, and I started by getting some PVC conduit glued up so I could run the wire for my electric car charger. And I decided to run this in conduit just in case I need to change any of this wiring in the future, since obviously electric car tech is changing pretty rapidly. I ran this pulling elbow out of the panel, and after installing it, I cut it to length to work with yet another elbow, which I could install after the plywood went up. Next, I got the plywood panel cut to size, adding a hole for the conduit, and then I went ahead and ran my wire into the panel, since it'd be a lot easier with the walls open. Once that was done, I threaded the wire through the hole in the plywood, and then got it installed. Then I decided to go ahead and finish the car charger install while I was at it. I ran 3/4 inch PVC conduit along the wall, then I needed to drill a hole through the front wall to run the conduit outside. Then I glued on a 3/4 inch threaded fitting and permanently attached the conduit in the garage before wrapping up the car charger installation outside. So this is a hardwired car charger, which means it came with a pre-installed whip, and I needed to run this whip into a junction box. Next, I could feed the wire from inside the garage through the conduit and wrap up the install by terminating the connections in the junction box, making sure to also ground the box since it was metal. With all that done, it was back to the plywood, and my next challenge was adding the plywood around this mini split. And since the mini split already had a layer of 1/2-inch drywall behind it, I figured I could just cut the plywood around the mini split. I obviously wanted this to be a pretty snug fit, so I really took my time measuring. I did some careful layout work on my panel and then used an 1.5-inch Forstner bit to drill the corner holes since they looked like they'd match up with the radius on the corners of the mini split. I used my track saw to make the straight cuts, connecting the holes I had drilled, then I finished the cut with a pull saw to remove any material the track saw couldn't get to. Finally, I could do a test fit, and thankfully the panel fit great and the corners matched up pretty much perfectly with the mini split. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Upside. Upside is a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, and dining. And the holiday season is the perfect time to start using Upside. And I personally use it to save on gas and groceries for holiday road trips, to see family, and hosting holiday dinners. There are over 100,000 gas stations, grocery stores, and restaurants on the Upside app, meaning cashback is always just around the corner. Upside has no confusing rewards, points, or credits, just actual cashback you can transfer straight to your bank account. To get started, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside, then pay as usual with a credit or debit card, follow the steps in the app, and then get paid. Upside has given back $1 billion to its users, and to find out how much you could earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code CRAFTED to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code CRAFTED. Thanks again to Upside for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. Next was the panel I'd been dreading the most, where both of the electrical panels were located, as well as some EMT conduit from when we converted from a gas to induction stove during a prior kitchen remodel. And as you can see, this took a lot of cutting, and I was definitely a little nervous about the test fit. All right, that was a lot of cutting. Let's hope this thing fits. Wow, okay. It's looking pretty good. Thankfully, after getting that panel installed, all that was left was the top row, which was pretty straightforward, although I did need to cut around the mini split again, but that was easier this time around. With that done, my last piece to add was a little filler strip by the electrical panel, and I'm not even sure this was really necessary because the panel cover mostly covers this, but I figured it was easy enough to add while I was at it. After adding the strip, I could reinstall the panel covers, flipping the breakers a few times in the process. Oh my God. And then take a step back and admire the walls. And I'll do a little sanding to knock off some of the fuzzies, but overall I think these walls look great and I'm really glad not to have to paint them. Next up was installing some trim, and this was mostly to cover up the damage from removing the drywall previously. I also decided to add some baseboard trim, which I think blended the plywood with the painted bottom plate nicely. I used 2-inch brad nails to attach the trim, making sure I was nailing into the studs, and after adding the first 2 pieces of baseboard, I could add a piece of corner trim. I needed to notch this trim around the conduit I installed earlier, and a Forstner bit and jigsaw made quick work of this. After getting it fit, I nailed the trim in place, and I'll come back and caulk the trim to the drywall later, since that will really help to keep the trim in place, since the nails don't really have anything to bite into with the drywall alone. From there, I continued on installing baseboard, leaving a small gap between the boards so I could caulk the seams later. I also realized at this point that I hadn't come back and added the rest of the screws to the plywood panels, so I went ahead and knocked that out. I like to use a line laser when doing this to make sure I don't miss the studs, which is surprisingly easy to do. I added screws spaced about a foot apart vertically, and these 1.25" GRK screws worked great and didn't have the tendency to blow out the plywood like some other screws I tried. Once that was done, I wrapped up the rest of the baseboard and corner trim, and I want to install some wider trim on that other side wall to match the rest of this baseboard, which I'll do later. Next up on the to-do list was making up the outlet boxes, and I figured it might be good to go over the basics of installing a 240 volt outlet while I was at it. All right, so here is how to wire a 220 volt outlet. I think this is something that if you've never done electrical work might seem kind of intimidating because it's more electricity, but it's actually really, really easy. So I've got my Romex here. This is 10 gauge wire, so this will be for up to a 30 amp circuit. And obviously I've left it way longer than it needs to be. So I'll start by cutting it to 6 inches or so. Then we need to strip back the sheathing. These wire cutters actually have a little sheathing stripper built in, which is a really nice feature if you're going to be working with a lot of Romex. Then below the sheathing, you've got a couple different layers of paper, one outer layer and then one inner layer. Those both will need to be cut back, as well as the rubber sheathing. Make sure not to score the jacket on the wire inside the sheathing. So then next we've got our 3 wires. In the case of a 220 or 240 volt circuit, the black is hot, but then the white is also going to be hot. So this particular circuit does not have a neutral. And then our bare copper is our ground. So you might notice the box I'm using to install this outlet is metal. I also need to ground the box in addition to the outlet, and there's always going to be a location for one of these green grounding screws in these metal boxes. And so the easiest way to do that is going to be to create a little pigtail, as it's called. So we can take that offcut of the wire and we can strip back the sheathing and then pull out the bare copper. So now we've got an extra length of bare copper. We'll go ahead and bend a little shepherd's hook on the end there, like that, and then we can install that in the box. And so then we want to tie together the ground that's connected to the box and the ground that's running back to the panel. And then once those are tied together, we can bring one wire to the actual outlet. And so there are a few different ways to do that. I think my preferred method are using Wago connectors. That being said, the only Wagos I have here at the house are the standard 221 connectors, which are only rated up to 20 amps and 12 gauge wire. This is again 10 gauge wire in a 30 amp circuit, so these are not going to work. Instead, I'll use a standard wire nut, which I really try to avoid using, honestly, but sometimes you have to use them. So then this is the outlet we're going to be installing. This is a NEMA 630R. I use these on pretty much all of my larger 30 amp circuits, just so I have consistency between my different plugs. So if I need to move a machine, I don't have to swap the outlet. And these are really easy to wire, because all you have to do is slide the wire in and tighten down the screws. You've got your 2-aughts and your ground, and that's it. And go ahead and strip back our wire. One other pro tip, the screws on these are a very specific bit size, ECX2 on these 30 amp outlets. This is an ECX1. As you can see, it's basically the combination of a flathead and a Robertson, but this is too small for this one. So since I don't have the ECX2, I will switch to a number 2 square. And then we can just fold our excess wires back. It's easier said than done with this 10 gauge wire. And then we can attach the outlet to the box with the screws that are included with the outlet. And unfortunately, a standard size plate is not gonna work here. I'm ready to bump up to a mid-size plate because I kind of overcut these holes. And then the last thing to do will be to test to make sure all my voltages are correct here. So let me go turn on the sub panel, and then I can turn on those 2 circuits, which are going to be table saw and planer jointer. And we can turn on our multimeter. So if we go from hot to hot, we should have 240-ish. And if we go from hot to ground, we should have 1/2 of that, 125. And then if we go ground to our box, we should have nothing, which we do. And we can check the same thing here, 247, 123 to ground, 123 to ground, and then ground to the box is nothing. So there we go. We should be good to go.
You might also want to install some of these 20 amp 240 volt outlets, and this particular outlet will be for my bandsaw. And the installation process is very similar here, except since I had a plastic box, I didn't have to ground the box as well. The connections on this outlet require shepherd's hooks, so I bent them and then connected the wire to the outlet, making sure the wire was wrapped around the terminals clockwise so the screws would pull the wire onto the terminal. Finally, I screwed the outlet to the box and added the plate, but I decided to add metal plates throughout the shop, which I have ordered and will install in the next video. Next, I could install the 120 volt outlets, and as I showed in the last video, I used 2 gang boxes for all of my 120 volt circuits, which meant each box needed 2 outlets.
I used Wago connectors to tie together all of my 120 volt outlets, and to make this easy, I went ahead and added pigtails to my 120 volt outlets before installing them. And this is why I save all of my Romex offcuts so I can repurpose them into these pigtails. And after adding the pigtails, I could add the Wago connectors. In the last box in the circuit, I could use 3-wire connectors, but I needed to use 5-wire connectors on the outlets where the circuit was passing through. Once that was done, I folded the wire into the box and attached the outlets and temporary cover plate to wrap up the installation. The existing outlets in the garage were on a 15 amp circuit. Instead, I decided to add some USB outlets to those boxes, both to differentiate them from the 20 amp outlets, but also to add some easy USB charging throughout the shop. Next, I went ahead and added pigtails to all of the remaining outlets, and then I could continue on making up the rest of the outlet boxes. And as you can probably tell, electrical work isn't usually super complicated, but there is a ton of repetition, and it's really easy to make mistakes if you're not focused. Case in point, I accidentally added a white pigtail to one of my gold outlet terminals, but thankfully I caught my mistake before actually installing the outlet. And that's why it's always a good idea to test your work after you're done, and I made sure to go back with an outlet tester to verify I'd installed everything correctly, which thankfully I had. Next on the to-do list will be upgrading my garage door opener, adding some more lighting and some acoustic panels, and a bunch more, so go ahead and get subscribed if you don't want to miss those videos. I'll have links to all the tools and materials I talked about in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy building.